The room was dim, suffused with the amber glow of a dozen antique lamps. Around a polished mahogany table, leaders whispered in clipped tones, their faces taut with unease. A single world map lay between them, dotted with red markers, like bleeding, wounds across continents. "If he succeeds," one whispered, eyes darting toward the shadows at the edges of the room. The balance of power shifts overnight. Outside, rain hammered the streets of Geneva, drumming against steel and glass. In a nearby alley, unmarked cars slid silently through puddles, their passengers cloaked in black. They were not policemen, not journalists. They were watchers, agents of interests that spanned oceans and empires. Their mission, to ensure that no African leader could ever dream too big. And yet, there he was, Ibrahim Traoré, a figure unknown to most of the world, a soldier shaped by hunger, betrayal, and a vision that stretched beyond borders. In Burkina Faso, children scavenged through dust-choked streets, mothers wept over empty bowls, and the old whispered stories of Sankara, a dream deferred, a promise of freedom stolen by unseen hands. Traoré had seen it all, and he had decided that enough was enough. His enemies were patient, shadowy, relentless. Global bankers who measured humanity in digits, intelligence networks skilled in deception, and even his own continent's traitors, hungry for power and fearful of change. They called him reckless. They called him naive. But in the shadows of his mind, a fire burned. A strategy so audacious that it could reshape the destiny of 35 nations. The ultimatum had been clear: unite Africa, or be crushed by a system designed to fracture dreams. Secret memos circulated in fortified offices, warning that Traoré's plan, a continental alliance of shared resources, wealth, and sovereignty, would threaten trillion-dollar industries overnight. Behind closed doors, leaders squirmed. "He cannot succeed," one muttered, and yet a chill ran down their spine. What if he did? As night deepened, a lone figure moved through the corridors of power, unnoticed, untraceable. Papers vanished. Phone lines went silent, and yet Traoré's vision moved forward. The world outside remained unaware. In the heart of Africa, a force was rising, quiet, determined, unstoppable, and in that silence one question lingered in the minds of both. Enemies and allies, what would Ibrahim Traoré do next? The answer would shake the foundations of the world. The sun rose over Ouagadougou with a dull, gray haze, the kind that carried the dust of unfulfilled promises. Streets teemed with life, yet the laughter of children was hollow, echoing off. The crumbling walls of forgotten schools. Markets bustled with urgency, not joy. Mothers weighed the cost of a loaf of bread as if it were gold. And in the midst of it all, Ibrahim Traoré walked with a quiet purpose, his boots stirring the earth that had carried generations of struggle. He saw what others refused to see, the bones of a continent rich beyond imagination, buried beneath centuries of exploitation. Oil that fed distant empires, gold that lined foreign vaults, lithium that powered technologies shaping the modern world. Africa was a sleeping giant, shackled by invisible chains. And yet, in the eyes of its people, he saw hope flickering. Fragile but undeniable. Traoré's vision was radical. 35 nations united not by coercion, but by shared destiny. Infrastructure built on cooperation, economies intertwined, resources managed for the people, not for distant shareholders. A $3.4 trillion powerhouse rising from the ruins of colonial neglect. To the world, it seemed impossible. To him, it was inevitable. But visions of liberation are never born in calm waters. From the shadows came the opposition, not loud, not crude, but precise, patient, lethal. The global financiers whispered through encrypted channels, sending directives to their allies across continents. Intelligence networks orchestrated misinformation campaigns, stories of corruption, whispers of coups, carefully planted doubts, to fracture trust. Even within Africa, some leaders looked upon Traoré with suspicion. Their wealth and privilege, earned or stolen, seemed threatened by unity. Betrayal, he knew, could come from any corner. He traveled secretly from capital to capital, sitting with presidents in rooms guarded by more than armed men. Discussions were muted, gestures small, every handshake a test of loyalty. And always, a question lingered. Would they dare break the chains that had bound their nations for decades? At the same time, ordinary people bore the weight of the continent's fractures. In Mali, a mother sold her last possessions to feed her children. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, miners worked in tunnels that gaped like wounds into the earth. In Sudan, soldiers questioned the orders that forced them to suppress their own. Their suffering was invisible to the powers that be. Yet it fueled the fire in Traoré's heart. Each act of injustice, each life discarded, strengthened his resolve. And he was not alone. He carried the legacy of Thomas Sankara, the revolutionary dream of African independence, a vision of dignity and self-determination that had been cut short by betrayal and bullets. Traoré understood the stakes. To unite, Africa was to awaken history itself, to confront centuries of manipulation, oppression, and greed. In secret meetings, plans took shape. A network of trusted advisors, economists, generals, engineers, mapped railways, energy grids, trade routes, and financial systems. Every blueprint, every memorandum, carried the weight of a future that could either liberate millions or invite catastrophic retaliation. Intelligence reports arrived constantly. Threats of assassination, rumors of staged coups, false reports designed to disorient. Yet Traoré moved methodically, calculating, anticipating, always 3 steps ahead. The West watched. From Washington to London, Paris to Berlin, strategists pored over maps and memos, their voices tight with concern. Africa's rising power was no longer theoretical, it was becoming tangible. Each secret meeting, each handshake between leaders was a small victory. Yet every step forward seemed to trigger a backlash. Sanctions were threatened, diplomatic channels poisoned, economies destabilized. Global powers had invested too, much in the old order, and the disruption that Traoré promised could not be ignored. And within Traoré's inner circle, shadows stirred. Among trusted aides were whispers of dissent, loyalty tested by fear and ambition. Some questioned his methods, others feared the consequences. He welcomed scrutiny, knowing that true leadership requires navigating treacherous waters where allies can become adversaries in a heartbeat. Each decision was a gamble with lives, with nations, with history itself. Yet, for all the darkness, there was light. Villagers spoke of Traoré in hushed reverence, tales of his humility and courage spreading like wildfire. Farmers, teachers, and soldiers shared stories of the man who refused to bow to external pressure, who met despair with strategy and cruelty with uncompromising vision. These stories, whispered in the streets, markets, and homes, became a tide of belief, a silent army more potent than any weapon. Africa's buried wealth, oil in Nigeria, gold in Ghana, lithium in Zimbabwe, became the foundation for what Traoré imagined. But wealth alone would not suffice. Trust, collaboration, and shared destiny were the true currency of unity. And yet, the threats continued. Assassins lurked in the shadows, misinformation poisoned minds, and coups loomed like storms over fragile nations. Each day, Traoré faced the delicate dance of diplomacy and danger, knowing that a single misstep could unravel decades of planning. And so, the stage was set. A continent fractured, a population desperate, and a man determined to rewrite history. In boardrooms, alleys, and dusty villages, whispers of a new Africa began to circulate. A secret army of believers, planners, and visionaries rallied around one man. And as the world held its breath, Ibrahim Traoré prepared for the impossible. To unite 35 nations under a single vision, to awaken a sleeping giant, and to challenge an order built on centuries of exploitation. The shadows watched. The global powers plotted, and the continent waited. Because the next move would not be a simple step. It would be a storm. The air over West Africa grew thick with tension, a heavy fog that seemed to seep into every capital, every market, every village. Invisible hands were at work, pulling strings, sending silent warnings that death and ruin could strike at any moment. The International Monetary Fund, ever vigilant, applied subtle pressure, tightening loans, delaying disbursements, and whispering of economic collapse. Each letter, each communiqué, was a reminder that Africa's independence came at a cost. A price calculated in lives, in opportunity lost, in hope stifled. In Burkina Faso, Traoré moved like a shadow, meeting with presidents and generals, in secret, often in unmarked buildings under the cloak of night. Maps were spread across tables, lit only by single bulbs swinging from ceilings. Discussions were precise, cautious. Every handshake, every word was measured. Loyalty was tested not just by promises but by survival. Outside, ordinary people felt the strain. Famine gnawed at villages. Mothers parted with their children's toys to pay for food. Soldiers questioned whether their loyalty belonged to their nations or to the invisible powers dictating their lives. Yet Traoré persisted. For every threat, there was a countermeasure. For every whisper of betrayal, a plan to root it out. He knew the dangers were real. Assassinations had already been attempted in neighboring countries, carefully staged accidents, sudden explosions, gunmen disappearing without a trace. He moved not recklessly, but deliberately, understanding that the weight of 35 nations rested on his shoulders. As he traveled, the continent revealed its contradictions. Cities glimmered with energy and ambition, yet the streets beneath their skyscrapers were littered with hunger. Mines and oil fields buzzed with production. Yet the profits left the continent, vanishing into offshore accounts and foreign stock exchanges. Traoré's vision was not just economic, it was moral. Africa could no longer endure this theft disguised as globalization. It was time to reclaim what was hers. But the opposition was cunning. Misinformation campaigns spread like wildfire. State. Media in some countries broadcast stories of corruption in Traoré's circle. Anonymous emails hinted at coups. Social media platforms, manipulated by unseen operators, amplified dissent, sowing doubt among leaders and citizens alike. Within his own inner circle, subtle treacheries emerged. Aides who questioned his judgment, envoys whose loyalty wavered, and whispers that reached foreign ears faster than he could intercept. The night before the pivotal summit, the tension reached a crescendo. In a remote villa on the outskirts of Ouagadougou, Traoré reviewed documents under flickering candlelight. Every line carried the weight of history, financial blueprints, intelligence reports, and letters of intent from 35 nations. Outside, the wind whispered through trees, carrying a message both literal and symbolic. The world was watching, waiting for a single misstep. The betrayal within his ranks became undeniable. A trusted advisor had been feeding information to foreign powers, leaking plans that could destabilize entire meetings. Traoré confronted the truth not with anger, but with cold clarity. He understood that unity required vigilance as much as vision. Any hesitation could unravel decades of painstaking diplomacy. Meanwhile, ordinary Africans endured the mounting pressures of global interference. In Nigeria, fishermen sold their catch for pennies while foreign corporations exported the majority of profits. In South Africa, miners dug tirelessly, aware that their labor enriched faraway elites. Soldiers across the continent were torn between duty and conscience, questioning whether their loyalty served their people or invisible overlords. Yet even amid despair, a quiet resistance grew. Whispers of a new alliance, rumors of an African pact that could rewrite the rules of power. Everywhere, Traoré's presence was felt. Meetings with presidents became rituals of trust and strategy. Discussions stretched into the night, punctuated by tense silences and the occasional burst of defiance. Leaders debated, argued, and tested one another, for fear and ambition are inseparable companions. Outside, intelligence agencies scrambled to predict his next move, only to find that he was always 3 steps ahead, anticipating every threat, every lie, every trap. The summit itself loomed like a storm on the horizon. 35 nations, each with its own history of betrayal and ambition, were to converge in a secret location. Security was paramount. Even a single leak could ignite chaos. Drones patrolled the skies, cyber attacks probed communication networks, and foreign operatives infiltrated safe houses under assumed identities. Every element of global power aligned to prevent the pact from materializing, yet Traoré's determination remained unshaken. As night fell, the final preparations were made. Leaders arrived one by one, wary, calculating, eyes flicking with suspicion. Intelligence reports predicted fractures, some even expecting the summit to collapse before it began. But Traoré knew that leadership demanded more than foresight. It demanded courage. And courage, he believed, was contagious. In the shadows, a whisper spread among his closest allies. This could fail. Everything could fall apart. Traoré acknowledged the truth, but did not flinch. For decades, Africa had endured exploitation, manipulation, and neglect. Now, the moment to seize destiny had arrived. He could not falter. The fate of billions rested on the fragile web of trust, strategy, and vision that he had spent years weaving. And so, with a continent watching silently, a world plotting in secret and betrayal lurking within reach, Traoré prepared to step into the eye of the storm. The night before the summit, all seemed poised on a knife's edge. One misstep, one whisper, one miscalculated move, and the dream of unity could shatter. Yet within the darkness, there burned a singular, unyielding flame, the audacious, unshakable vision of a united Africa, ready to rise from the shadows and claim its place in history. The stage was set. The actors were in place. And as the first rays of dawn touched the continent, a new chapter, one fraught with danger, betrayal, and unprecedented challenge, was about to begin. The morning of the secret summit arrived like a storm breaking over the savannah. 35 leaders, each a sovereign force, converged on a fortified location hidden from satellites and prying eyes. Helicopters hummed over the compound, their rotors slicing through the heavy air, while armed guards patrolled corridors lined with steel and glass. Even the walls seemed to vibrate with anticipation, aware that the fate of a continent hung within. Inside, the room was tense, electric. Delegates from Africa's richest and poorest nations sat across tables polished to a reflective sheen. Each face told a story. Suspicion, fatigue, ambition, and fear intermingled in subtle expressions, small gestures, eyes darting to measure loyalty and intent. The air smelled of coffee, expensive cologne, and the faint metallic tang of apprehension. Every move, every word, carried monumental weight. Outside, forces unseen tested the summit before it even began. Drones patrolled the skies, scanning for weaknesses in security. Cyber attacks probed the compound's networks, seeking to disrupt communications, leak data, or sow confusion. Foreign operatives slipped past checkpoints under assumed identities, blending with aides and staff, ready to ignite chaos at the slightest opportunity. The global establishment had thrown everything at stopping this moment. Yet within, Traore remained calm, an anchor in a storm of mistrust and intrigue. The opening minutes were a trial of patience. Leaders argued over the order of discussion, each protective of their nation's sovereignty. Some insisted on preconditions, others threatened to leave entirely. Traore listened, taking mental notes, reading every flicker of emotion. He understood that unity was not given. It was wrested from fear, doubt, and centuries of division. He needed a strategy that would turn suspicion into solidarity. And then the revelation came. Leaked documents, smuggled by whistleblowers, were displayed on discrete screens. Pages detailing decades of foreign exploitation, oil siphoned to foreign banks, mining contracts written to enrich outsiders, agricultural policies manipulated to create dependency, illuminated the room like a harsh spotlight. Leaders recoiled in disbelief. Anger flared. The betrayal of their ancestors, their people, was laid bare. The summit, meant to be tentative, erupted into controlled chaos. Voices rose, hands slammed tables, and the room seemed on the verge of fracturing entirely. Traore rose. The room fell silent, not out of fear but because of presence, the quiet, unshakable force of a man who had carried this vision through fires of adversity. He spoke without theatrics, yet every word resonated. With weight, the history of exploitation, the potential of unity, the moral imperative to seize destiny. He did not promise ease, comfort, or wealth without struggle. He promised a future carved from courage, forged in collective resolve, and bound by shared destiny. The speech worked, but not without trials. Some leaders still hesitated, voices of doubt echoing through the room. Threats from outside forces, military, economic, covert, were real, and some delegates feared the consequences of defiance. Traore acknowledged these fears openly, allowing leaders to express concerns, to negotiate terms. Through hours of painstaking dialogue, compromise, and raw honesty, barriers began to crumble. Trust, fragile yet growing, emerged as the summit's most precious currency. Even as unity took root, sabotage did not cease. A cyber attack momentarily blacked out communications. A drone alarm triggered panic in one wing of the building. Security teams acted swiftly, but the tension only heightened. Traore's calm was contagious. Leaders, inspired by his composure under pressure, began to mirror it. The summit had become a crucible, one that would test not only strategy and will, but courage under the weight of global opposition. Minutes stretched into hours. Alliances formed and fractured and reformed in rapid succession. Documents were signed tentatively, amended with careful negotiation, and countersigned with solemnity. Every signature was a declaration. Africa would no longer be a pawn in the games of foreign powers. Every nod of agreement, every handshake, reinforced the new order being forged. And then, the final act of revelation. Detailed plans for a $3.4 trillion alliance encompassing energy, infrastructure, finance, and defense. The magnitude of the EE project was staggering. Skepticism arose once more. How could 35 nations, many still grappling with poverty, conflict, and corruption, manage such an unprecedented union? Traore did not flinch. He had anticipated doubt. He unveiled a phased, meticulously structured plan, transparent governance, shared resources, accountability, and mutual benefit. Leaders, seeing both vision and feasibility, began to rise in solidarity. The pact was signed. 35 nations, bound by shared purpose and destiny, had committed to rewriting the rules of power. Cameras did not capture the moment. It was too secret, too potent. Yet within those walls, history had been made. Cheers erupted quietly, but with immense relief and reverence. The $3.4 trillion African powerhouse was no longer a dream. It was reality. And yet Traore knew the truth. Unity comes at a price. Allies had been tested, spies neutralized, lives risked, and reputations gambled. The pact was only the beginning. Enforcement, cooperation, and vigilance would be required to protect what had been so painstakingly achieved. As the summit concluded, a cinematic silence fell over the compound. The weight of history pressed upon every participant. The outside world remained unaware of the seismic shift that had occurred. But Africa had awoken, bound by vision, courage, and defiance. And at the center of it all, Traore stood, not as a conqueror, but as a guardian of destiny, a symbol of a continent reclaiming its narrative. Outside, the first hints of dusk painted the sky crimson and gold. The storm of resistance had been weathered. The pact was signed. And though the world would not yet understand it, the course of history had shifted irrevocably. But the shadows remained. Threats would linger, enemies would regroup, and the price of unity would reveal itself in ways even Traore could not yet predict. Yet in this moment, the impossible had been achieved. 35 nations standing together, a $3.4 trillion powerhouse born from courage, conviction, and relentless vision. The world woke the next morning to a silent tremor that no earthquake could explain. Stock markets in New York, London, Tokyo, and Frankfurt quivered, algorithms unable to comprehend the seismic shift that had occurred overnight. Analysts debated, commentators speculated, and governments scrambled for explanations. But the truth was simple, immutable. Africa had united. 35 nations, once fractured by borders, history, and foreign manipulation, now stood together as a single economic and political powerhouse. In Burkina Faso, the streets of Ouagadougou overflowed with life. Mothers carried children on their backs, their eyes reflecting awe and relief. Children danced in alleys once lined with hunger and despair. Vendors sold goods without fear of exploitation. Students walked with books in hand rather than petitions. The air hummed with possibility. Across villages and cities, the same scene unfolded. A continent awakening not to chaos, but to hope. Infrastructure projects, long stalled by corruption and foreign control, surged forward. Railways, highways, and energy grids were redesigned for shared prosperity. Africa's natural wealth, oil in Nigeria, gold in Ghana, lithium in Zimbabwe, became the backbone of a continental economy managed by Africans for Africans. Factories, refineries, and renewable energy plants opened, creating jobs that stretched from the Sahara to the Cape. Power, once siphoned abroad, now fueled homes, schools, hospitals, and industries. The new African currency, a symbol of sovereignty and unity, began to circulate. Its launch was met with cautious optimism abroad and quiet panic among global financial elites who had long profited from a divided continent. Central banks that once dictated policy now watched a continent take control of its own destiny. The message was clear. Africa was no longer a stage for foreign ambitions. It was a player on the global stage, independent, powerful, and coordinated. Traore, though at the center of this transformation, did not seek adulation. He moved among the people, visiting villages, schools, and hospitals. He spoke little of his achievements, letting actions speak louder than words. Yet wherever he went, people saw in him not just a leader of Burkina Faso, but a guardian of continental rebirth. Soldiers who had once questioned their loyalty now marched in formation, inspired by a vision that transcended borders. Students who had once feared the future now studied with purpose, knowing that opportunity had returned to the continent. The pact's immediate effects rippled across politics and diplomacy. Foreign powers, accustomed to exploiting division, were forced to recalibrate. Economic sanctions, previously designed to isolate, were neutralized by African cooperation. Trade agreements were renegotiated, investments redirected to ensure mutual benefit rather than exploitation. International institutions, once instruments of control, now faced a continent that refused to bow to their agendas. Yet even amid triumph, vigilance remained. The unity achieved was fragile, forged under threat and necessity. Internal conflicts, rival ambitions, and external pressures continued to loom. But the lessons of the summit, the power of solidarity, strategic vision, and courage in the face of overwhelming odds had cemented a new reality. Africa had proven that it could stand together, not as fragmented states, but as a single entity capable of reshaping its destiny. Across nations, celebrations erupted. In South Africa, children painted murals of a united continent. In Egypt, teachers recited the stories of Traore and Sankara, linking past dreams with present victories. In Lagos, markets overflowed with goods, reflecting prosperity returning to the hands of the people. Across the Sahara and Savannah, urban centers and remote villages alike hummed with a quiet joy, a sense of purpose long denied. Traore's presence became a unifying symbol, yet he remained a man of action rather than spectacle. He convened councils of ministers, advisors, and citizens, ensuring that governance reflected accountability, transparency, and inclusivity. Policies were enacted to eliminate corruption, to empower local industries, and to protect natural resources from exploitation. Africa's future, once dictated by external powers, was now written by its people, guided by visionaries committed to justice and equity. The global reaction was mixed, yet unmistakable. Markets adapted, foreign investors reconsidered strategies, and international powers recognized a new balance. Africa, long treated as a peripheral player, had claimed its place at the center of economic and political influence. Traore's leadership, forged through adversity, strategy, and unyielding vision, became a case study for generations. His courage had turned despair into defiance, skepticism into solidarity, and fragmented nations into a powerhouse poised to reshape global dynamics. In villages, cities, and capitals, the people reflected on the journey. Mothers who had once cried over empty bowls now cooked meals with surplus. Students who had feared limited futures now dreamed freely. Soldiers who had doubted their orders now defended a continent with pride. Across 35 nations, the echoes of a united Africa resounded. Hope was no longer fragile. It was unstoppable. And as the sun set over the continent, painting skies in shades of amber and gold, one thought prevailed. Africa had rewritten its story. No longer merely a tale of survival, exploitation, or despair, it had become a narrative of ambition, unity, and destiny. Ibrahim Traoré stood quietly on a balcony overlooking Ouagadougou. The wind carried the scent of earth and possibility. He did not boast, nor did he celebrate loudly. Instead, he reflected on what had been achieved, the risks taken, the betrayals endured, the battles won not with weapons, but with vision. And in that quiet, cinematic moment, the continent held its breath, knowing that history had shifted irrevocably. Was this the moment Africa stopped being a story of survival and became a story of destiny?